There is a moment, somewhere around hour 6 of being completely alone in a whiteout blizzard at negative 27 degrees Celsius, when your brain stops processing fear the way it normally does and starts doing something else entirely. Something quieter and more focused, and in a strange way, more honest than almost anything you have experienced in ordinary life. The noise falls away. The usual mental chatter, the plans and the worries and the background hum of a normal human mind moving through a normal human day, all of it gets stripped back to something fundamental. Something that has been running in the background of every human who has ever lived, the oldest program, the one written in the deepest part of the brain, the one that says, survive, figure out what is happening, make a decision, stay alive. I did not go out there to find that moment. I went out there because I thought I knew what I was doing. I thought I had prepared. I thought I understood what a mountain winter in that region could produce. I was wrong in ways that I am still months later working through, and the story of exactly how I was wrong and what happened because of it and how I got through it is what we are here for today. Subscribe right now if you want to be here for what comes next, because this channel goes to the places and into the situations that most people only ever read about secondhand, and we do it with everything we have. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the blizzard, but the beginning of the trip, because the decisions that nearly killed me were not made on the mountain. They were made long before I got there, in the quiet of preparation, in the overconfidence of a person who had done hard things before, and assumed that doing hard things before was sufficient preparation for doing harder things. The range I was heading into sits in a part of the world where winter is not a season in the way that most people from temperate climates understand the word season. It is not a period of cold and inconvenience. It is a force, a presence, a thing with genuine intentions toward anyone who enters it without complete respect. The mountains here rise above 3,000 meters, and the plateau between them sits at elevations between 1,500 and 2,000 meters. And at those elevations, in the depths of winter, the weather systems that develop can produce conditions that are legitimately lethal with a speed and completeness that takes experienced people by surprise on a regular basis. People who live in these regions, who have spent their entire lives learning the behavior of these mountains and these skis, people who carry generations of accumulated knowledge about how to read the signs, still die out here sometimes. Still get caught. Still make the one wrong call that turns a manageable situation into an emergency. I was not from this region. I had done my research. I had spoken to people. I had consulted maps and weather services and the accounts of other travelers who had moved through the area in winter. I had my gear laid out and checked and repacked 3 times. I had my emergency protocols. I had my communication devices. I had done, I believed, everything that a responsible solo traveler preparing for a serious winter expedition should do. What I had not fully absorbed in the way that information becomes understanding was the specific character of this particular weather. Not winter in general, not cold in general. This specific system, this specific mountain topography, this specific combination of plateau winds and moisture from the far side of the range and the way temperature inversions in the valleys can make the readings at the nearest weather station functionally meaningless for what is actually happening 12 kilometers away and 500 meters higher. That gap between information and understanding is where I nearly died. The first day was extraordinary in the way that first days in genuinely wild places almost always are. The kind of extraordinary that confirms everything you told yourself when you were deciding to do this, that makes you feel the particular vindication of a person who chose to go when most people choose to stay. The sky was clear, and the light was the specific white gold of high-altitude winter sun, sharp and shadowless and almost painfully bright on the snow. The landscape was enormous. That is the word that kept coming back to me as I moved through the first hours of the trek. Enormous, not just large, enormous. The scale of everything, the distances between features, the height of the ridge lines against the sky, the vast open sweep of the plateau that stretched away in every direction, compressed every human reference point into something tiny and made you feel not small exactly but appropriately scaled. This is the real size of things. This is what the world actually is when you are not inside a building or a vehicle or a city, insulated from the scale of it. I was moving well. The snowpack was dense and well consolidated, which made the footing predictable and the travel efficient. I had done my first 8 kilometers by early afternoon and found a position behind a natural rock outcrop that broke the wind and offered a clear sight line to the ridge I planned to reach the following day. I made my camp with the efficiency of someone who has made camp in cold places before, all the practiced movements of pitching in wind and cold, the tent first, the sleeping system inside it, the stove positioned to shelter it from the breeze, the water melting from snow in the pot. I ate well, I wrote in my journal, I slept. The second day started with a change I noticed but did not adequately interpret. The sky to the northwest, the direction of the prevailing weather in this region, had a quality that is difficult to describe to someone who has not spent time in high mountain environments. Not cloudy exactly, hazy in a specific way, a milkiness at the horizon that dulled the definition of the ridge lines and gave the light a flat, diffuse quality that it had not had the day before. I noted it. I checked my forecasting tools. The weather service I was consulting showed a system developing but not expected to arrive in force for another 36 to 48 hours. I made my assessment. I decided to continue. That decision was the pivot point. Not obviously, not dramatically, not with the clarity of hindsight that makes decisions in retrospect look like choices that a reasonable person would recognize as dangerous. In the moment, it felt like a calibrated judgment made with available information. Move forward, cover ground while conditions are still favorable, position myself better for the day after tomorrow when the weather arrives, get to the shelter of the upper valley before the storm. A plan. A reasonable plan, I thought. What the weather service did not capture, and what I had no way of knowing from the instruments I had access to, was that the system was moving significantly faster than modeled, and that the orographic effect of the specific ridge configuration I was moving toward was going to amplify the winds at elevation in a way that the regional forecast did not and could not reflect. The mountains were about to do something to the weather that the weather data did not predict, because the weather data was not measured at this specific location on this specific mountain at this specific altitude. It was measured somewhere else, interpolated, and applied here with a confidence that the underlying model did not deserve. By late morning of day 2, the sky had gone completely white. Not cloudy white, white in the way that a whiteout is white, which is different from what the word suggests to someone who has not experienced it. In a whiteout, you do not simply lose visibility in the way that fog reduces visibility, where you can still see the ground under your feet and objects close to you even if the middle distance disappears. In a true whiteout, the light becomes completely non-directional, reflected equally from the snow on the ground and the cloud above, so that there is no shadow anywhere and therefore no visual information about the texture or contour of the surface you are moving on. The ground and the air become the same white. You cannot see where the ground ends and the sky begins. You cannot see whether the slope in front of you rises or falls. You cannot see the hollows that might swallow your foot or the sastrugi ridges that will catch it. You are moving through a dimensionless white space with no reference points except the compass and the GPS and the knowledge that the mountain does not care whether you can see it. The wind arrived about 40 minutes after the whiteout completed. It did not build gradually. It did not give me the kind of warning that a gradual wind increase provides, where you have time to reassess and make decisions as the situation develops. It came like a physical wall. A sound first, a low roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once because in a whiteout sound directionality is as distorted as visual directionality, and then the wind itself hitting me with a force that stopped me mid-step and required an immediate and significant lean into it just to stay upright. I want to tell you what negative 27 degrees Celsius with wind actually feels like on exposed skin, because I think most people, even people who have experienced serious cold, have not experienced this specific combination of temperature and wind, and understand it only abstractly. The wind chill at the speeds I was experiencing brought the effective temperature to somewhere between negative 45 and negative 50 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, exposed skin does not have minutes before frostbite begins. It has seconds, literally seconds. The moisture in your nasal passages starts to freeze when you inhale. Your eyelashes carry ice crystals within a few breaths of exposure. The metal components of your equipment become hazardous to touch with bare skin. And the deeper problem, the one that goes beyond the immediate pain and damage of extreme cold, is what the cold does to your physiology over time. The human body in extreme cold begins a process of prioritization that is automatic and essentially unstoppable. It begins pulling circulation away from the extremities and concentrating it around the core organs because the core organs are the irreplaceable ones, the ones the body will sacrifice everything else to protect. Your fingers lose dexterity, your toes lose feeling, your face numbs. And as the cold penetrates deeper, your cognitive function begins to degrade in ways that are subtle at first and then catastrophic, because the brain is a warm organ and it does not function well when its temperature drops even by a fraction of a degree. The decisions you make when you are beginning to get hypothermic are worse than the decisions you make when you are warm. Your assessment of your situation becomes less accurate. Your risk tolerance changes in ways that are dangerous. And you do not know this is happening because the part of your brain that would recognize impaired cognition is itself impaired. This is the trap. This is the thing that kills people who know about hypothermia and have studied its symptoms and have told themselves they will recognize it and respond correctly. You do not recognize it in yourself because recognition requires the very capacity that has been compromised. I knew all of this, I had read about it, I had been told about it by people with more experience than me, And in the first moments of the storm, when my cognition was still intact, I made what I believe was the decision that saved my life. I did not try to continue toward my objective. I did not tell myself I could push through to the shelter I had planned to reach. I stopped. I got myself oriented using my compass and GPS, confirmed my position, and made a single clear decision. Get down, get sheltered, get the tent up immediately. Pitching a tent in those conditions is something I had practiced. Not in conditions this severe, but in serious wind and cold, and the practice was the only reason I was able to do it, because by the time I had my gloves off for 30 seconds to handle the tent poles, my fingers had already lost significant dexterity. You know how you have a skill that lives in your hands, something your hands know how to do in a way that bypasses conscious direction. That is what tent pitching in extreme cold has to become. Not a procedure you remember and execute step by step, but a physical knowledge, a muscle memory, that runs even when the fine motor control needed for delicate conscious manipulation is gone. I found a depression in the snow, not natural. I had to dig it. A shallow pit that would reduce the wind load on the tent and give me some protection from the worst of the gusts. I dug with my poles and my hands for 6 minutes, and the effort of digging, the physical exertion of it, was itself a calculated risk, because exertion in extreme cold produces sweat, and sweat in extreme cold is dangerous. Moisture against the skin accelerating heat loss in a way that can cascade rapidly. But the alternative was pitching on the exposed surface, which in those wind speeds had a meaningful chance of producing a catastrophic tent failure. The pit was the right call. Getting the tent up took what felt like forever and was probably 12 minutes. Every gust was a full-body wrestling match with a piece of fabric that wanted to become a kite. The pole segments fought me, the connections slippery with ice, my fingers registering the work they were doing less and less clearly. But the tent went up. I got it staked and guyed with everything I had: 4 corner stakes, 2 midpoint stakes on each long side, and 4 separate guy lines tied to anything I could find, and weighted with snow-packed stuff sacks where there was nothing to tie to. I got inside. And then I lay there for probably 3 minutes, just breathing, listening to the tent fabric thunder and crack in the wind, registering the extraordinary contrast between the violence of what was happening on the other side of a few millimeters of ripstop nylon and the relative stillness inside. Not warm, not yet, but out of the wind. And being out of the wind, when the wind is at those speeds and that temperature, is a transformation of the situation that is almost incomprehensibly significant. The wind chill effect disappears entirely when you remove the wind. Inside the tent, with my body heat beginning to build in the still air, the temperature was already climbing toward something manageable. I ran a systems check, mentally, methodically working through everything. Fingers checking sensation and movement in each one. Toes harder to assess through boots, but the pain of returning circulation was actually a good sign. The absence of pain in previously cold extremities is the worrying state. Face, running my gloved hands over my cheeks and nose and ears, feeling for the wooden, waxy texture that indicates tissue damage. I found 2 spots on my right cheek that were numb and had the beginnings of a frost nip discoloration. Not full frostbite, not yet, not the deep tissue freezing that does permanent damage, but the precursor, the warning. I pressed my warm hands against them and held them there for a long time. Then I started the stove. There's a phrase in survival literature about the psychological importance of hot food and drink in a survival situation that I always read as a kind of soft, morale-boosting aside, the kind of recommendation that acknowledges the emotional dimension of survival without being quite as important as the practical steps. I understand it completely differently now. The psychological effect of a flame in a dark, cold, violent situation is not soft. It is not a nice to have. It is a fundamental reorientation of your relationship to the situation. The flame says, you have agency. You can produce warmth. You are not passive, you are acting. And acting, even the small action of lighting a stove and melting snow and making tea, is the difference between the mental state that manages a crisis and the mental state that is managed by it. I drank hot water first because I was dehydrated, because I had been moving hard in the cold and the cold air is brutally desiccating, and thirst is suppressed in cold environments in a way that makes it an unreliable guide to hydration status. Then I made food, the highest calorie thing I had, because caloric deficit in extreme cold is genuinely life-threatening in a way that it is not in temperate conditions. Your body in extreme cold is burning fuel at a rate that would be extravagant in any other context. Shivering alone can account for a significant fraction of your resting metabolic rate, and if you run out of fuel, your core temperature will fall regardless of how good your insulation is. I calculated my supplies. I had food for 3 more days at normal rationing, which meant perhaps 2 days at the caloric rate the cold was demanding. I had fuel for the stove for approximately the same period. I had water, or rather I had snow, which is an inexhaustible water supply if you have fuel to melt it. My communication device was charged. I had sent a position check to my emergency contact before the storm hit, and they knew where I was within a few kilometers. I was not in a situation where rescue was impossible or even very difficult if it came to that. But I was in a situation where I needed to stay put and stay competent and manage my resources carefully and wait. The wind did not stop. This is the thing about a serious mountain blizzard that differentiates it from most weather events in ordinary life, which have beginnings and ends that are separated by hours. This storm, once it arrived, settled in. It was not a passing front. It was a system established and rotating, finding the natural amplification of the mountain topography and maintaining its intensity with a consistency that made the first hour feel 12 hours later, exactly like the present moment. The noise was constant. The tent flex was constant. The cold penetrating through the floor of the tent was constant. The only thing between me and the snow pack a few millimeters of insulated sleeping mat, and the snow pack was essentially a heat sink of unlimited capacity pressing upward against it. I managed the time in blocks. This is a cognitive strategy that I had read about and that turned out to be genuinely important in a way that transcends the practical reasons usually given for it. The practical reason is that it prevents you from doing the terrible math of a survival situation, from sitting in hour 3 of a storm and thinking about the 40 or 50 or 80 hours that might still be ahead, and the resources you will need and the unknowns you cannot calculate, and the things that might go wrong that you have not thought of yet. That math, done in its entirety, produces a state of anxiety that is itself dangerous. It depletes mental energy that you need for the actual problems in front of you. It creates a relationship with time that makes every hour feel like a defeat instead of an achievement. The block strategy works differently. You decide, for the next 2 hours I am going to manage my situation. That is all, not the next 2 days, not the overall problem of being trapped in a blizzard at negative 27 degrees. Just the next 2 hours, and in those 2 hours there are specific manageable tasks. Check your extremity, eat something, drink something, check your equipment. Adjust your sleeping position to keep circulation moving in your legs. Write in your journal if you have one, because writing is a way of keeping your mind organized and your cognitive function monitored. You will notice in the writing if your thoughts are becoming confused or repetitive, which are early signs of hypothermia. Transmit your position to your emergency contact. And then, when the 2 hours are done, start the next 2 hours. This is not a method for making the time pass faster. It is a method for making the time meaningful, for giving yourself the experience of progress in a situation where actual progress in terms of movement toward your goal or reduction of your overall challenge is impossible. You are making progress through time. You are completing blocks. You are hour by hour surviving. That is the goal. Survival is measurable in 2-hour increments. Around what I estimated to be midnight, though my sense of time had become somewhat elastic, the tent took a hit from a gust that was qualitatively different from the sustained wind. A rotor, probably a turbulent vortex generated by the wind flowing over the ridge above and curling back on itself in the way that mountain winds do, and it hit the tent from a direction slightly different from the prevailing wind, putting tension on the structure in a geometry it was not designed for, and one of my guy lines pulled its anchor. I heard the stake come out. I felt the tent wall change shape. And I made a decision in about 3 seconds that I am still impressed by in retrospect, even though in the moment it felt less like a decision and more like an automatic response. I had to restake it from outside in the storm at night. The preparation for that 3-minute operation took almost 15 minutes because the preparation was everything. I layered every piece of clothing I had. I checked that every zipper was fully closed, every Velcro strap was secured, every gap between glove and sleeve and between balaclava and collar was eliminated. I tied a cord from my wrist to the tent pole, not long enough to let me go more than 2 meters from the tent, because in a whiteout at night the tent is your universe, and you do not go more than 2 meters from your universe without a tether. I had my replacement stake in my hand before I opened the zip. I had rehearsed the motion of staking it and driving it in. I had told myself exactly what I was going to do in sequence before I did it. And then I opened the door and the storm was there exactly as it had been all day, exactly as loud and cold and violent, and I did what needed to be done. I had the new stake in and driven and the guy line reattached in less than 3 minutes. I got back inside. I zipped the door. I lay there shaking, not from cold alone but from the specific adrenaline of a person who has just executed a small, important, competent action under extreme pressure. And the shaking felt almost good, felt like the body's acknowledgement of something done correctly. The second day inside the tent was harder than the first in a way that I want to be honest about. because most survival narratives I have read skip over this part or treat it briefly or frame it in terms of physical challenge rather than psychological reality. The second day was harder because the novelty had worn off. The first day in a survival situation has an intensity that occupies your whole mind. Everything is happening for the first time. Every decision is new. The adrenaline is still present. You are sharp and focused and fully in the moment in a way that is almost exhilarating, even in a terrible situation. The second day is different. You have already made the big decisions. You have already done the inventory and the rationing and the communication and the physical management of your situation. You have already had the insight that you are going to handle this, that you are going to get through it, and that insight, which should be reassuring, carries with it the weight of all the hours you are going to have to fill before getting through it is actually accomplished. My mind, with nothing specific to do and the physical situation relatively stable, began to do what minds do when they are confined and stressed. It began to review my preparation, the decisions I had made, the decision to continue on day 2, the gap between the forecast and the reality, all the things I could have done differently. This is a normal cognitive response to a dangerous situation, and it serves an important evolutionary function, learning, encoding the experience so that future decisions are better. But in the moment, confined in a tent in a blizzard with nothing to act on and nowhere to go, the review process can become something that works against you. It can become rumination. It can become the specific self-laceration of a person replaying their mistakes in a context where the mistakes cannot be corrected. I want to be honest about this because I think it is the most real and most underreported part of a survival experience. The enemy in hour 30 of that situation was not the cold which I was managing. It was not starvation, which was not yet a factor. It was not even exhaustion, though I was tired. The enemy was my own mind doing something unhelpful with the quiet it had been given. The way I dealt with it was simple, and I recommend it without reservation to anyone who finds themselves in any kind of confined, stressful, extended situation. I wrote. I wrote in my journal in real detail, not the efficient note-taking of someone documenting a situation, but the full writing of someone trying to articulate exactly what they are experiencing and why and what it means. I wrote about the decision on day 2, not to condemn myself for it but to understand it, to trace exactly what information I had and what I believed about it, and why that belief was wrong and what I would need to know and do differently to make a better decision in a similar situation. I turned the rumination into analysis. I turned the replay of mistakes into something that might produce learning, which is the only useful thing you can do with a mistake, while you cannot yet act to correct it. I also wrote about other things. I wrote about the landscape I had seen on day 1, the quality of the light and the scale of the plateau and the way the snow had been sculpted by earlier winds into forms that looked designed, looked intentional, the long flowing sastrugi ridges and the hollow carved bowls around the larger rocks, the shadows blue and sharp before the whiteout swallowed everything. I wrote about what I had heard in the last clear hour before the storm, the total silence that these high mountain plateaus have in the absence of wind, a silence so complete that you can hear your own heartbeat and the sound of snow crystals settling and the creak of your own clothing. I wrote about everything I had planned to do and see and experience in the days after the storm cleared, which was a way of projecting myself into a future in which I had gotten through this, which was itself a form of insisting on that future, a refusal to accept any other outcome. At some point in the second night, the quality of the storm changed. I was awake, monitoring the way you stay half awake in uncertain situations, never fully descending into deep sleep but cycling through lighter states that provide some rest without the complete loss of awareness. And in one of the lighter states, I noticed that the sound had changed, not stopped, not even reduced dramatically, but changed in character from the steady, unvarying roar that had been the background of 30-some hours of my life to something more rhythmic, more variable, with moments of slightly greater quiet between the gusts rather than a continuous wall of sound. Systems have edges. The edge of this one was approaching. By morning of the third day, the wind had dropped to something that was still fierce by any normal measure but was transformed relative to what it had been. The tent was no longer in constant flex. The guy lines were taut but not singing. I could hear the difference clearly, and 2 hours after I first noticed the change, I unzipped the tent door and looked out into a world of absolute, overwhelming white. The snow had continued falling through the second night, and the landscape was completely remade. The depression I had dug to shelter the tent was filled in, and the tent itself had accumulated a significant snow load on the windward side that I needed to shift before I could move. The sky was still overcast but high and thin, the kind of high cloud that comes after a system clears and diffuses the light without blocking it. The wind was from the northwest, consistent now, perhaps 40 kilometers per hour, which is not comfortable but is navigable with proper clothing. I made the hottest, strongest drink I had supplies for and sat at the tent door looking at the remade landscape and did an honest assessment. Two things were clear. My objective, the ridge I had been moving toward, was now buried under significantly more snow than before the storm, and the avalanche risk on the upper slopes was elevated enough that my original route was not viable without equipment. I did not have a partner to manage the risk properly. And my physical state, while not seriously compromised, was not the state I had been in before the storm. 30-some hours of confinement in a tent in extreme cold, with restricted movement and elevated metabolic demand, had taken a toll that would not be reversed quickly. The intelligent decision, the decision that a person with all their faculties and no ego involvement would make looking at the situation clearly, was to descend. To navigate back to the lower valley and the track I had come in on and make my way out. I'm going to tell you that I made that decision more cleanly than I actually did, because the truth is that I spent an embarrassing amount of time arguing with it internally. The thing about a serious trip in a serious landscape is that the distance between you and your goal, when you come very close and then have to turn back, is one of the most specific kinds of psychological pain that outdoor travel produces. It is not like failing to achieve something you did not try. It is the close thing, the almost thing, the thing that would have been yours if the weather had behaved differently for 36 hours. It is the gap between what you came for and what you are going to get. But this is also, I understand now, one of the most important things that a serious environment teaches you if you let it. The mountain is not withholding your objective. The mountain is not doing anything to you. The mountain is a mountain. It does not know you exist. It does not care about your plans or your preparation or how far you have come. It is simply doing what mountains do, which is exist at altitude with their own weather and their own physics and their own complete indifference to human ambition. The decision to turn back is not a defeat. It is an acknowledgement of what actually is versus what you want to be. And in a survival situation, the gap between what actually is and what you want to be is exactly where people die. I turned back. The descent took most of that day, and it was its own kind of challenge, not the static crisis of the tent but the active challenge of navigation in a landscape whose landmarks had been significantly altered by the snowfall. Terrain that I had memorized on the way in, the specific shapes of rock outcrops and the profile of hillocks and the paths between them, was either buried or softened to unrecognizability. My GPS was the essential tool, the track I had recorded on the way in now the only reliable guide, and I followed it carefully, checking at every significant decision point, moving conservatively because the avalanche conditions on the steeper slopes were real and I was navigating them alone. The cold was still serious, not the storm cold, not the wind chill extreme, but the settled cold of a high mountain winter in the aftermath of a system, the ground temperature deeply negative, the air temperature at the GPS on my wrist showing between -20 and -23 for most of the descent. At these temperatures you do not stop for long without addressing your insulation, because stopped is cold and cold is the enemy, and the enemy is patient in a way that you have to match. I moved in a rhythm of 45 minutes of movement and brief stops to check navigation and eat something small and drink something hot from the insulated container, keeping the machine running. I want to talk about the snow itself for a moment, because the snow on that descent was extraordinary in a way that I was, despite everything, aware of and grateful for. The storm had deposited fresh powder over the older consolidated snowpack, and in the places sheltered from the wind, the north-facing hollows and the lee sides of rocks, it had settled in formations of such delicate specific beauty that they stopped me even in my focused, conservative descent. The crystals were still intact on the surface in the sheltered spots, not yet compacted or wind-damaged, each one a visible, intricate, temporary thing, hexagonal and complex, and lasting approximately as long as a breath of warm air. The light in those sheltered hollows had a blue quality reflected off the shadowed snow that was unlike the light anywhere else. A cold, luminous blue that existed only in those specific microsites, and only for the few hours before the wind or the sun or the thermal radiation of the ground surface changed the snow to something else. I have been in beautiful places before. I have been in places that produced the specific physiological response of beauty, the involuntary catch of breath, the arrested motion, the feeling of something opening in your chest. The high mountain winter landscape in the aftermath of a blizzard, when you have just spent 30 hours in a tent fighting that blizzard and are now moving through its aftermath with the specific clarity of someone who has survived something, is beautiful in a way that is almost impossible to describe because it is not separable from the fear and the effort and the relief. It is not beauty you can appreciate at a comfortable remove. It is beauty that arrives through the body, through the physical experience of being present in a place that could kill you and has chosen, so far, not to. That is the closest I can get to it, beauty as the product of genuine stakes. Beauty as something that the landscape gives you only when you are fully in it, not observing it but participating in it, not looking at it but experiencing it as a complete physical and psychological engagement. By late afternoon, I had cleared the upper plateau and was descending into the valley where the cold and wind were significantly reduced by the elevation drop and the shelter of the valley walls. I had my camp on the valley floor set up by early evening, and that night, lower and calmer and with my emergency contact confirmed and a clear route to the trailhead for the following day, I slept the specific sleep of a person whose body has spent 3 days managing something serious and is now, at last, allowing itself to release. It is a very heavy sleep. I remember almost nothing of it. I remember lying down and then I remember waking up with the kind of complete disorientation that comes from extremely deep sleep and an unknown amount of time having passed, and then the recognition of where I was and what I had just come through, arriving not with the drama you might imagine but with a quiet, settled weight. I had been in serious trouble. I had managed it. I was alive. There are things I know now that I did not know before, not as information but as understanding. There is a difference and the difference matters. I knew before I went that weather systems in mountain environments can be faster and more severe than regional forecasts predict. I know it now the way my body knows it, the way my decision-making knows it, with a depth that changes how I will approach every similar judgment in the future. I knew that cognitive impairment in extreme cold is subtle and dangerous. I know it now with the specific respect of a person who felt the edges of it, who noticed the beginning of the slowing and caught it and acted while catching it was still possible. I knew that preparation matters. I know now what specific parts of my preparation were good and what was insufficient, and what I had not prepared for at all because I had not understood it was something to prepare for. The gap between information and understanding is the gap that nearly killed me. I want to say that directly and without qualification. I was not unprepared in the way that a reckless or inexperienced person is unprepared. I had done real work. I had acquired real knowledge. But knowledge that lives only in your head, that has not been tested and integrated and made physical, that has not been run through the actual conditions and refined by the actual consequences, is not the same as understanding. And in an environment that does not forgive the gap between them, that gap is measured in lives. I have been asked since I got back whether I would do it again, whether the experience was worth it, whether the objective value of what I saw and learned and survived justifies the risk I took. And I find the question difficult to answer in the way it is usually framed as a simple cost-benefit analysis, because it treats the experience as something that can be assessed from the outside, as something you can weigh from a position of safety and comfort. The experience is not like that. It is not something that happened to me and can now be evaluated at a distance. It is something I participated in, and the participation changed me in ways that are not yet fully legible to me and may not be for some time. What I can say is this. There is a version of yourself that exists on the other side of genuine, extended physical emergency, a version that has been tested by something the ordinary world does not test you with, and that version is different in specific ways. More honest about risk, more honest about your own limits, more honest about the difference between confidence and competence. And perhaps most importantly, more honest about what the world actually is when you are fully in it rather than insulated from it. When the stakes are real, and the conditions are genuinely extreme and the gap between a good decision and a bad one is not a matter of inconvenience or cost, but of whether you survive to make the next decision. The mountain does not care about you, the blizzard does not care about you, the cold is not malicious and it is not benign. It is simply what it is, a physical reality operating according to physical laws with a completeness and a consistency and an indifference that is, when you are in it, one of the most clarifying things I have ever encountered, because it removes every negotiation, every excuse. Every story you tell yourself about the way things should go or the way you deserve for things to go or the exceptions that should apply in your case. In a blizzard at -27 degrees, there are no exceptions. There is only what is true. And being in the presence of what is only true, stripped of every comfortable fiction, is an experience that changes the way you see everything else afterward. Not better necessarily, not worse, different, correctly sized. The world as it actually is, not the version you inhabit when you are warm and safe and insulated from the physics of the thing, the version that was there before you arrived and will be there after you leave and does not change its fundamental nature for anyone who enters it. I came out of those mountains with both hands, both feet, both ears, my face mostly unscathed except for a small area of my right cheek where the frost nip left a slight sensitivity to cold that lasted for a few months afterward. I came out with my gear and my journal and several hundred photographs taken on the clear first day, before the world went white. I came out with a respect for that landscape